morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this session. And I'd like to firstly just sort of thank the panel, especially there was quite a bit of last minute change around in the sort of session topic. So Dave Stone, Chief Scientist from the JNCC, is going to be chairing the session. There's a lot of knowledge here, a lot of experience to do ask questions and participate in the session. It should be really interesting, so some lively discussion would be great. And I'll hand over to Dave, just let me pull the presentation.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, good morning, everyone. I can't emphasise that. Ask questions, lively discussion. We want opinions and views. Jess and I have a quiet ambition of getting a bit of a paper out of this to stir things up. So your opinions are important. So as it says there, I'm Dave Stone, Chief Scientist at JNCC. For those of you who don't know what JNCC is the UK statutory body constituted by the 4 nations of the UK. So we deal with standards and matters that function at the UK level. So reporting to the CBD and other multilateral environmental agreements, working with the statutory bodies in the 4 nations around sort of standards in relation to, say, things like common standards monitoring, making sure that we're in a line when it comes to designating sites and those sorts of standards. And our remit covers not just the UK but the overseas territories, Crown dependencies as well. So, and we do a lot of work in international waters. So that's what the JNCC is. We are an advisor to government in effect, but that partnership with the country agencies is absolutely, and the devolved administrations is critical to what we do. Right, you're going to get a few words from me, and then you're going to get the really smart stuff from our panel of speakers. It's early in the morning. You all danced too hard last night, perhaps had 1 or 2 glasses of wine too much. So,
Clicking through.
Is it clicking?
Oh, sorry. Wrong one. That's one. There you go.
Right. Simple, quick reminder of why peatland matters, and I, in this audience, I don't really need to say it. So it's because it's early in the morning, and we had a hard night. So it's about carbon sequestration and storage, water quality, flood mitigation, biodiversity, a whole range of things. The peatlands globally are estimated to store between 450 and 650,000 megatons of carbon. So they're significant in that regard. But when is peatland not peatland? And a lot of that depends, and this is really the crux of what we're going to focus on today. So a lot of the definitions at the moment are largely informed by agricultural considerations. How much could you plough, in effect, at one point? And that's where a lot of those understandings of depth have come from. And there's a range of thresholds, largely, that across the globe, from 20 to about 50 centimetres, depending on the activity. And importantly, that definition defines what we often consider to be the extent. It relates to the carbon and then that brings us to considerations of carbon density. And those reflections on carbon suggest that we should be really working around about 10 centimetres as a sort of threshold for peatland. Just to put that in perspective a little bit. So the UNEP Global Assessment of peatland estimated there's close to 500 million hectares of peatland globally. That used a 30 centimetre depth threshold. And that map, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, gives an indication that we've got roughly 32% of that in North Americas, about 33% in Asia. Europe accounts for about 12%, and 8% in Africa. That's using a 30 centimetre threshold. This is Russia. That first map is using the 30 centimetre threshold, and that gives us roughly 139 million hectares. The second map, if we apply a 10 centimetre threshold, increases that to 368 million hectares.
10
So,
or 20?
sorry?
Sorry, 10 or 20?
So that's taking away, so that's a 10 centimetre threshold, that one's using a 30. So those 20 centimetres of difference almost triple the area that we would consider to be peatlands within the UNEP definition. So that's sort of why depth matters. That's why this discussion is quite important today. The sort of basic premise here then of this discussion is, do we need a sort of unified UK-wide approach to peat depth? There are a number of things we want to achieve, and we've got excellent speakers to take us through this, highlighting sort of case studies and discussions about the implications and definitions of peatlands. We've got some discussion around the complications that are caused by having a slightly uneven approach, 20, 30, 50 centimetres. We want to consider what are the implications in terms of funding for restoration in relation to those sort of depth definitions, but also what are the implications for planning and development as well, and the sort of impacts on industry and decisions. So it's a lot of ground to cover, but we're going to bring that together and then focus down on, you know, what would be a reasonable approach in terms of the UK. So that's my introductory ramble over, to give you a bit of context. Richard Lindsay, I think probably everybody in this room knows who Richard is currently out on a bog. But he, by the miracle of modern technology, he's our first speaker and has very kindly done a bit of a pre-record as an introduction to today's discussions. So I shall pass over to Richard.
Hello, I'm Richard Lindsay of the University of East London and also the Senior Research Advisor to the IUCN UK Peatland programme. I want to talk to you today about how we define peat, how we map peat, and why this matters. The biggest challenge when identifying and mapping peat is that the thing which defines peatland is hidden underground. The surface vegetation itself may give no indication as to whether this vegetation is sitting on 1 metre of peat, 10 metres of peat, or no peat at all. Indeed, what do we mean when we use the term peat? What is peat? Definitions of peat vary, but common to all definitions is that peat is dead plant matter preserved and accumulated by waterlogging. And all definitions agree when the peat is as deep as this. Where, for example, is the boundary between peat soil and heathland soil in this image? Is it indicated by the change from fawn-coloured cotton grass to the dark tone of heather? But the heather cannot be rooting in bare rock, so organic material must have accumulated sufficiently for the heather to root and grow. So, is this peat? These sphagnum-rich springs, with their underlying organic layer, are only around 10 centimetres thick and are quite distinct from the wet mineral marsh surrounding them. It's difficult to describe these springs as anything other than peatland. As such, this small piece of material taken from such areas is quite evidently peat. It is dead plant matter accumulated over time within a waterlogged environment which has prevented complete decomposition of the material. Yet, within certain other contexts, all these examples would fail to be defined as peat. Definitions and classification systems are always devised for a purpose, and after World War II, the UK economy was in terrible shape, so natural resources capable of being economically exploited were a high priority. As this 2014 Scottish Natural Heritage Report summarises, the Scottish Peat Committee was established in the late 1940s to, amongst other things, identify areas suitable for commercial peat extraction. Peat less than 50 centimetres deep was deemed unsuitable for this purpose, so the definition of peat in Scotland came to be applied only to those areas considered exploitable, i.e. greater than 50 centimetres deep. This definition was subsequently adopted by what became the Soil Survey of Scotland, and has remained so right up to the present day, with the 2023 Wildlife Management and Muirburn Scotland Act making rotational burning on peat more than 50 centimetres deep illegal because it is damaging. One is left to assume that rotational burning on peat which is only 40 centimetres deep is somehow not damaging. The post-war focus on soils in England and Wales was directed more to agricultural potential than suitability for peat extraction. The result was that the Soil Survey of England and Wales in effect used the plough as the yardstick, setting the definition of peat as 40 centimetres or more, as we can see in the present Land IS definitions for peat soil types, because this reflected typical ploughing depths. This definition is also used today by DEFRA to prevent damage from rotational burning on peat within protected sites. Peat, which is only 30 centimetres deep within protected sites, is, one must assume, regarded as somehow immune to the effects of burning. The key consequences of the currently used definitions for peat in the UK is that peat which is shallower than 40 or 50 centimetres becomes invisible, and the consequences of such invisibility become very considerable indeed. Definitions matter because they can radically change both the scope and the scale of an issue. Here we can see the range of estimates for the extent of UK peat published during the course of the last 40 years. The blue dots indicate that estimates of deep peat, i.e. more than 40 to 50 centimetres, have varied between 1.5 million hectares and double that at 3 million hectares. Add in peaty soils, or shallow peat, which are the orange dots, and the estimates more than double, rising to more than 7 million hectares. Spatially, we can see the effect of adding shallow peat into the UK peatland inventory, with green and pink shading more than doubling the extent of peat soils. But as long as the official definition of peat remains at 40 to 50 centimetres, these additional areas are invisible to land use policy, funding support instruments, and restoration action. In contrast, what is the approach of our continental neighbours to peat and peat soils? This is now the de facto Bible for peatlands throughout the continent of Europe, providing descriptions of peatlands for all 49 nations of Europe. Of these 49 nations, 17 don't use a depth threshold at all, while 26 of the remaining 32 use a threshold of 30 centimetres or less, including Russia. The focus is instead on whether an organic rich layer, no matter the thickness, has accumulated because of waterlogging. The majority of European nations would thus have no problem in defining this as a peatland, whereas in the UK it would be invisible to policymakers concerned with peat. If the present UK definitions were to change, what then might replace them? How might we define and recognise peat? The most obvious criterion would be that there is evident accumulation of dead plant matter resulting from waterlogging of the material, rather than because conditions are simply acidic and nutrient poor, as is found on dry heaths. If the plant material is highly decomposed, so plant fragments are not obvious, the black colour of the soil is instead a clear indicator, because no other soil takes on this hue apart from some heathlands. Ground truth can quickly distinguish between well-drained heathland and waterlogged peat. This black hue can often be discerned using remote sensing at certain times of the year. In this case, the ploughed peat soil fields of Königsmoor in Germany stand out from the surrounding landscape. A further source of potential information consists of the Environment Agency flood risk maps, in particular combining the river and coast flood maps with surface flooding maps and using the longest flood return cycle. We've found that this combination of maps can be extremely helpful in identifying likely peatland areas, particularly in the lowlands. Why is it important that we have a better grasp of the UK's peat resource? Reluctant though I am to focus on a single ecosystem service, because I believe that this leads to distorted outcomes, there's no getting away from the fact that carbon storage is one, and just one, of the key services provided by peatlands, and to a much greater extent than for any other habitat. If we look at the typical carbon stored across the world's soils, histosols, i.e. peat, stand out as the predominant means of carbon storage. If we take average figures for sphagnum peat, herbaceous peat and decomposed peat from Julie Loysal's extensive peatland database, using bulk density, organic matter content and carbon content, we can feed this into a neat piece of code written by Jack Cook of Aberystwyth University to calculate the amount of carbon stored within a hectare for a given depth of peat. We can then compare this with published figures for tropical rainforest. Sphagnum-ridge peat is the least carbon dense, but even here, for a depth of only 30 centimetres, at 90 tonnes of carbon per hectare, we are already equalling or exceeding some of the lowest carbon values for tropical rainforest. If instead we consider just 30 centimetres of highly humified peat, a condition often typical of shallower peat, we can see that at 240 tonnes of carbon per hectare, we are holding more carbon than the majority of documented tropical rainforest carbon. For carbon alone, shallow peat is our tropical rainforest, yet it remains invisible to those who hold its fate in their hands, simply because a definition makes it so. I've been told that it would be too difficult both to map this resource and then to embrace it within policy decision making. So we look the other way. We turn a blind eye to it. Yet the most famous occasion of turning a blind eye was when Admiral Nelson put a telescope to his blind eye when reading a flag message from the Admiral of the fleet, calling all ships to turn away from the Danish fleet because the dangers were seen to be too great. Nelson ignored this message, chose to face the difficulties head on, and won the famous Battle of Copenhagen. As John F. Kennedy once said, we choose to do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Thank you.
We shall record that applause and play it back to Richard later today. As ever, from Richard, a lovely description of some quite technical issues there in a simplistic way. But I think it effectively highlighted some of the challenges that we want to discuss today. So it's my pleasure now to welcome real life speakers. First of all, we've got Andy from RSPB, Andrew Midgley. The floor is yours, Andrew.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So yeah, I'm Andrew Midgley. I work in the policy team in RSPB Scotland, based in Edinburgh. I am going to, sorry, I should say that one of the things that resonated with what Richard said there is depth matters, and effectively what I'm going to do is illustrate why it matters in the area that I work in. So I spend most of my time engaging with governments, with civil servants, with agencies around the policy, trying to improve the policy, and these are some of the issues that I've come up against. I know that some of the other speakers are probably addressing things in a slightly different angle, so I'm just going to cover the thing that I spend most of my time dealing with. So what I want to do is just give you one example, first of all, of why depth matters in the field I'm working on, and specifically, high-level climate change policy. And then I'm going to go in slightly more detail into specific areas that illustrate where the depth issue comes up, and then I'd sort of ask some questions about, well, where next? So I should say as well that because I work in policy in Scotland, most of my examples are actually around Scotland. So I'm aware that the audience is a bigger constituency, but that's the thing I know most about. So I'll just give you that example. It just raises those issues, and they can apply in different ways in different places. So what I want to do is just start with the big picture, which is the way that peat depth sort of feeds into our understanding of the policy challenge that we face around climate change. So these figures are the latest data for Scottish greenhouse gas emissions for 2022 in Scotland. So this is the way the Scottish Government reports the data. So it says that the biggest single sources of emissions is domestic transport, and then we go agriculture, buildings and product use, and so on. And then land use changes down here. Now, one of the things I do every year is just to sort of delve a little bit deeper into this. So when you delve into that land use change and forestry category, it's a net calculation. It gives you a figure which is nearly zero. When you unpack that, what we realise in Scotland is that we have huge emissions and huge removals, and they're being obscured by that data. So the huge emissions, what we find is that actually they don't cancel each other out, because if we've got emissions from the land in one part of the country, say peatlands in the Highlands, just because there are lots of trees in Dumfries and Galloway, it doesn't mean that those emissions in the peatlands aren't happening. So it's actually more illustrative to open this up a little bit. And what we see is that emissions from the land are the biggest single source of emissions in Scotland. And I kind of focus on that because it's really important for policy. Because if you think about what climate change policy focuses on, it's focusing on transport. Rightly, we have to do all these things. We have to do all of it quicker, but it's focusing, the top of the list is transport, heating, that sort of thing, aviation. Whereas in Scotland, our biggest issue is land use, but that's not really recognised. We can unpack that even a little bit more. So this is the LULUCF category, above the line and below the line. And we see that peatland accounts for the biggest proportion of those emissions from the land. So the figure for Peatland was around about 6 million tonnes, around about here. So it's actually equivalent to bigger than all the emissions from industry in Scotland. So the key issue here, though, is, well, how do we know that? We're not measuring all of those emissions directly. So we have to do it through calculation, and the way that it's calculated, there's a huge amount of work that's gone into this by people who are extreme experts in this, and they may be in the room, I'm not sure, and so I hesitate to speak about this. But essentially, my understanding is that the calculations for the emission factors of peatland are based on the depth definitions, which are most common in each country, so 40 centimetres in England, 50 centimetres in Scotland. Now we know that that means that there's a large area of peat that's less than 50 centimetres that isn't even included in these figures. So the question then is, what would that picture look like if peatland were defined in a different way? So it's a big issue for policy. If we really want to understand the climate change challenge that we face, we need to think about how we're defining peatland. So I'm just going to go through some specific examples that essentially highlight some of the contradictions. So I went to one of my colleagues that covers UK forestry, and they pointed out to some of the inconsistency. So firstly, with woodlands, there is the UK forestry standard, which essentially sets the definitions 50 centimetres, as you will probably all know. But there is this slight catch-all, it's a caveat in there, or depth specified by the country guidance. So generally 50 centimetres is the sort of prohibition level. Don't grow on deep peat, essentially. Some clarification around that. In England, the guidance, that's this decision support framework for the protection of peatland, goes to a sort of effective operating principle that woodland creation won't be approved in areas of soil where soil organic matter content of 30% and peat greater than 30 centimetres. So the definition of peat again matters, because if we go to Scotland, we're operating according to the general UKFS definition, with some extra additional caveats around ploughing. So the 10%, the no woodland creation applications be supported where there's ploughing on peat greater than 10 centimetres. So we end up in this relatively, the different rules in different places, essentially. That's the point I'm making. So it's interesting to note that in England, the definition, in my view anyway, I don't know, it looks like there's a much more precautionary approach being taken in England than in Scotland. So although Scotland has the precautionary principle embedded post-Brexit in our legislation, that we should be implementing the precautionary principle, we're actually not in this instance if you compare it to England in this way. And what this highlights is that actually the depth definitions that are being applied are in effect political, because there are practical and pragmatic considerations. There are stakeholders with an interest, and the decisions that get made about what depth is applied is in some part arbitrary. But in this issue around woodlands, you do get to an important sort of empirical question, and there's lots of work going on around this space, which is, how do you determine, if you're not going to go from some arbitrary level, how do you determine what level would be that level that would give you an appropriate carbon balance when you're not planting trees and damaging or releasing more carbon than you are sequestering over decades, so that it does actually contribute to meeting our targets in the medium term? So there's an empirical question, and there's work going on that as we speak, or in recent years. So the next example is around Muirburn. So I was involved with our advocacy around the Wildlife Management and Muirburn Now Act. And peatland was a critical issue around the Muirburn elements of that piece of legislation. And so I just point to where it ended up. So peatland is defined here as land where the soil has a layer of peat of a thickness of greater than 40 centimetres. So effectively, what we're seeing happen is that where there is peat shallower than 40 centimetres, it's not considered peatland. So there's an important point to hold on to. And the implication of this, the consequence, is that it feeds into a new licensing regime. So that if you wanted to undertake burning for sporting management or for farming, there will be certain rules that apply in different places. So above 40 centimetres, deeper than 40 centimetres, you wouldn't be able to get a licence to burn for sporting or agricultural purposes, although you may be able to get a licence to burn for other purposes, depending. So in the legislation, the main one is to do with wildfire mitigation. But if you're below 40 centimetres, it's okay. You know, you can apply for a licence to burn for sporting and farming purposes. So the consequence of that is that burning is allowed under licence over large areas of peat that we would call shallow peat, for want of a better term, and arguably they're the more vulnerable areas. So we're protecting the deeper areas. There's a bit of a, you know, you can argue that, but essentially, you know, we're taking an approach which is not protecting a very large area of relatively vulnerable peat. So the questions that arise for me in this are so the first one is, are we losing the peatlands? And this speaks to the IUCN paper on the lost peatlands. And that's where this comes to, what this triggers with me is this definition. We've gone from deep peat, we're talking about deep peat, you shouldn't burn on deep peat, and that was 50 centimetres. But now in the legislation, peatland, it's not just deep peat, it's peatland, is anything over 40 centimetres. And so when that is mapped, anything that doesn't fit in that box is not peatland. And that has consequences. So that's the first sort of question. And I think it sort of echoes some of what Richard said. And then there's this issue around different depths applying, so the same manager, having to deal with different sorts of depth thresholds. So I'm not expecting you to go right into detail. This is just to illustrate a point. There are also depth thresholds that apply to farming. So in Scotland, the system for the support for farming is still quite connected to the way that the system worked from the EU under the old cap. So we still have cross-compliance. And under the current cross-compliance, there's the standard management requirements, and then there's the good agricultural and environmental condition rules. These are the basic rules that farmers have to abide by in order to be eligible to get their support. And GEEC 6 is about the maintenance of soil organic matter, and it says that a farmer must comply with the requirements of the Muirburn Code as they relate to the maintenance of soil organic matter. And then it gives some examples that you can't leave a fire unattended and so on. So,
sorry, Andrew, I'm not clear on the definition of cross-compliance.
So cross-compliance is a term that it catches the rules that farmers must abide by in order to be eligible they comply with the set of rules that makes them eligible for farm support payments.
Right.
It includes standard management requirements, which are legal requirements about not polluting things, and a set of measures called good agricultural and environmental conditions, and they set a baseline that farmers absolutely have to meet, and they don't require farmers to do more, they just say you can't damage. So in this instance, you shouldn't be doing something to damage peat, and that means so you have to abide by the Muirburn Code. So the critical thing about this is that in the Muirburn Code, burning shouldn't take place on peatland. This is the existing Muirburn Code. Shouldn't take place on peatland where it exceeds 50 centimetres in thickness. So the 50 centimetre depth definition applies to farmers as well. Cross-compliance is changing next year, and GEEC 6 is going to stay in there, and you will still have to abide by the Muirburn Code, but the Muirburn Code, because of the Wildlife Management and Muirburn Act, is being changed and must abide by the depth definition in the legislation, which is now 40 centimetres. So GEEC still applies, 40 centimetres will come into play. Next slide. In addition, next year, a good thing has happened in that the government wants to strengthen this measure. So the government wants to say that there should be new provisions for peatlands and wetlands included in GEEC 6. And so it's going to say that farmers are not allowed, they should not carry out ploughing, cultivations reseeding, no draining, new drainage or maintenance of existing drains, no application of pesticide and so on. But, critical point, this will apply to where the land is at least 50 centimetres. So we're going to have, unless it's changed, we're going to have a Geek 6 where there's some things you can do at 40 centimetres and there are some things that you can do at 50 centimetres. So it begs the question about confusion and complication. So the issues here for me are, we have industries that have to deal with different depth definitions in different places. Thinking about, so woodland, for example, not necessarily such a big issue, but it's certainly a complication because it relates to mapping and quality of data. And it just probably makes things a bit more difficult for industries trying to get things done. But equally, we also see that we could have, for an individual land manager, a really complicated picture in that they could have a certain set of rules for one depth of peat and a certain set of rules for a different depth of peat, and yet they have no real clarity on how deep the peat is. So it gets really messy. So the question, sorry, just to go back, the question that one of the things, my experience from the Wildlife Management Muirburn Bill was that we were arguing for 30 centimetres because we thought that was as pragmatic as you could get, because the government was didn't seem that keen to change, and it was like, how far can we pull in this direction without being just completely ignored for being unrealistic? So we were arguing to lower the depth, but that means we're still arguing to retain a depth threshold, and we completely recognise that has its issues, as we've illustrated. The question that I ended up asking was actually, we know that depth thresholds are a really blunt tool. They create these lines in the landscape which don't really exist in reality, and yet they have very big consequences, potentially. So should we be moving to a much more sort of inclusive approach to thinking about peatlands, especially if we consider that starting point about climate change and emissions from peatlands? Now, I'm not going to suggest any of this is easy, because there are trade-offs and consequences if you have a different approach. And so the thing that I'm aware of, we did a piece of work recently where we tried to model how land use could change to get to net zero. And one of the things is that you see the trade-offs that are involved. And so just to illustrate one of those things is, if we went to this model where we did away with depth thresholds, and how would forestry, how would we reach our tree planting targets, that sort of thing? Well, essentially, the knock-on consequence is that the tree planting would be pushed into other areas, and then that creates other trade-offs, because it would be pushed into areas where food production takes place at the moment. So then you get into a complicated picture. And so you end up, if you do away with depth thresholds, and there's a strong argument to think that actually we're treating this resource as being extremely precious, and we should be protecting it as best we can through our management, and arguably enhancing and restoring as much as we can, then the issue is, can we get to a point where we need to approach things in a different way? It's about the ecosystem services, the natural capital, but that needs much better data, information, and then discussion around land use change and how we move forward, because it gets into a complicated picture where different industries have different requirements and so on. So I guess where I got to was that these depth thresholds are really complicated in the sense that they make life difficult for people. They have perverse consequences, arguably, but changing them is not necessarily easy, and we have to approach that in a sensitive way and involve a lot of work. That's me.
Thank you, Andrew. That was quite provocative in a lot of ways, so thank you very much. Any quick questions for Andrew? Sort of points of clarification before we move on? Yeah.
I was wondering, with these changes in legislation that are getting implemented every so often.
Sorry, just for a second, for the recording, can we just make sure we're doing questions into the mic? Sorry, I wasn't aware we were
Sorry.
doing questions. Just 2 seconds, please. Thank you.
I think my voice is quite loud though.
It's just to pick it up at the back of the room for the recording.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh god, this is going to be echoey. Is that working?
It should.
Yeah.
My question here is, with all these changes in legislation, changes in policy that come through, as you say, it's already a minefield for landowners and agricultural land users to figure out what applies to them currently. How are these changes being communicated to those people that they apply to?
It's piecemeal. So the cross compliance rules are communicated through the rural payments and services website, and through press releases, and through the conventional communication channels with farmers. So it essentially just comes down to the established routes. There isn't, but they tend to be discrete. So forestry communication, may be a bit more focused on foresters. So there isn't necessarily this broad issue. So there'll be lots of people who aren't necessarily aware of the 40 centimetre muir burn rule, that sort of thing. So there's still a job to be done, I think, in terms of getting that message out there.
Thank you, Andrew. Right, I'm going to move us on now. It's now a pleasure to introduce Mark Owen of Natural England, and I didn't know what your latest job title was. Principal Officer, Peatland Team.
Principal Officer, Peatland Team.
There we go. Thank
Should
you.
have a working clicker now.
Which button? That one.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, so good morning. My name's Mark Owen. I'm now a Principal Officer. With for some reason that I can't fathom, we've changed our titles from advisors to officers, but there you go. I'm in Natural England's Peatland Team, in its Strategy and Government Advice Directorate. My main job role is around uplands, so everything I'll say, or most of the things I say, are uplands focused. And clearly I'm England, so whatever I say about regulation or policy relates to England rather than anywhere else. But what I'm going to talk about is the issues around peat depth from a regulatory and policy perspective. I debated with myself whether I should put a capital R in the word regulatory there, but I decided to go with lowercase. But it's a bit of both going on, a bit of capital R regulatory and a bit of lowercase. I'm going to contradict Richard Lindsay, sorry. Because I'm going to try and show that we're not blind to shallow peat. And I'm also going to talk more about definitions of deep peat rather than peat generally.
Mark, sorry to interrupt. Are you comfortable using the lectern mic, or would you like the handheld one so you can wander around?
I'll stand here.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, just to pick it up for the recording. Thanks.
I was trying to avoid being recorded. Have I done? Oh, I've turned it off. So I'm going to do a number of things. I'm going to talk about peat depth issues from that regulatory perspective. So I'm going to talk about the inconsistency, and Andrew's already helped along with that a little bit. I'm going to talk about conflation we get between the term deep peat and the term blanket bog, and that's a bit of an issue, certainly in England. I'm going to talk about spatial variation in depth and what problems that causes us. I'm also going to talk about another couple of issues which exercise my mind, and they are about redeposited peat, peat that is now not in the place that it was formed, and what I will call former deep peat, peat that once upon a time was deep, by whatever definition you care to choose, and is now not. Still peatland, but not deep peat anymore. So in England, we've got a number of definitions based on depth. We've got the UK forestry standard that Andrew referred to, which gives us a figure of 50 centimetres, and that seems to be the hangover from the things that Richard was talking about. But as Andrew said, that differs to country definitions where they're different. In England, we've got regulations in our heather and grass burning regulations 2021. The regulations refer to deep peat at being 40 centimetres or more. We've got an England peat action plan, which also describes deep peat as in excess of 40 centimetres. I'll come back to that in a minute when we talk about shallow peat. We've got a blanket bog restoration strategy published by Natural England in 2015. That also uses 40 centimetres. And we've got a document called the Blanket Bog Land Management Guidance, which is aimed at land managers, and that also speaks to 40 centimetres. Now those documents are not independent, they feed off one another, and they all feed off that definition of deep peat based on the soils definition that people have talked about of 40 centimetres. And that's where the 40 centimetre value in those documents comes from. And we've been hung up on that for a little while in England at least. Now, the IUCN, helpfully, have advised us that there is an ecologically based definition of deep peat that is around 30 centimetres. And that 30 centimetre value is found in the trees and peat guidance, so-called, and that's the, you used the correct term for it now, I can't remember what it's called, the guidance framework for the protection of peatland, which is a Natural England Forestry Commission and forestry research document, which outlines where it is appropriate to develop new woodlands, and it suggests that new woodlands in England should not be developed on peat over 30 centimetres, or crucially, on hydrologically functionally connected shallower peat. So there is an element of consideration there of peat that it is not deep by the those terms. Incidentally, in the Nature for Climate Peat Capital Grant Scheme, the threshold for being appropriate for land for being appropriate for grant aid is also 30 centimetres, but that also allows the possibility of functionally connected peat being suitable for restoration, of functionally corrected peat of lower depth being suitable. In England, we have a thing called the Sustainable Farming Incentive, and one of the options available to farmers in that is a grant available to do a moorland map, known as PA5, and in that, blanket bog is defined as peat over 30 centimetres. So there's a direct connection between the 30 centimetre figure and the term blanket bog. If it's not 30 centimetres and it's peat, it's wet heath, apparently, according to that scheme. One of the other things that Natural England does is that we are advisors to, in England, the Rural Payments Agency, which operates the Agri-Environment Scheme, the Countryside Stewardship. And in that scheme, there are options for moorland management, UP3 so-called. And one of the main purposes of the prescriptions in UP3 was to ensure that land managers did not do anything that could result in the UK government being infracted by the European Commission because of the concerns about burning on deep peat. So those prescriptions do not allow land managers to burn on deep peat, which is defined as over 40 centimetres, and there's a reference in there to blanket bog, which could be any vegetation on deep peat. So direct protection for deep peat over 40 centimetres as part of countryside stewardship. However, countryside stewardship UP3 prescriptions also suggest that people should not burn on wet heath. But there is no definition in the scheme of what wet heath is or any relationship to peat depth. Clearly, deep peat, more than 40 centimetres, is not wet heath because it's blanket bog. But there's no definition of what wet heath looks like, what it is, or what peat depth there is. And that poses a significant problem for Natural England, because we don't necessarily know where all the wet heath is, and it's certainly a problem for the land managers. And the way we've got round that is that we, rather than rely on a peat depth value, we provide a map saying that this is where your wet heath is, that's where that prescription applies. When we spoke about the England Peat Action Plan, I said I would come back to that, and need to do that in respect of shallow peat, because the England Peat Action Plan does define what shallow peat is, and it defines shallow peat as peat between 10 and 40 centimetres. Clearly, the 40 centimetre value is obvious, because above 40 centimetres is deep peat, according to the England Peat Action Plan. But it's interesting that it gives that 10 centimetre value, which accords broadly with what Richard Lindsay suggested for shallow peat. But we'll probably come back to this point later, but at that sort of depth, you're starting to propose significant problems for regulators and land managers understanding, knowing whether they've got shallow peat or not. Richard talked about the difference between peat and not peat being the plant remains not being not decomposing in compared to heathland. How do we know? How does the land manager know? How do we know whether, if you're standing on a shallow organic deposit, whether that is peat according to the definition that Richard used, or it's not? That's problematic. I mentioned that I want to talk about this distinction between deep peat and blanket bog. And those terms have become interchangeable, which is perhaps unfortunate. We know that not all deep peat is blanket bog. There are raised mires, there are other mires that are not blanket bog. And it's probably the case, and I think Richard hinted at it, that it's perfectly possible to find blanket bog or typical blanket bog vegetation on peat that is not deep by whatever threshold that you choose to apply. So we think that blanket bog can occur on shallow peat. Is that important? Well, it's important in terms of the regulatory and the policy arena, because those terms get mixed up. In the heather and grass burning regulations in England, the regulations themselves refer to deep peat. They refer to the regulations require that anyone burning on deep peat that supports anyone burning specified vegetation, which is rough grass, heather, vaccinium or gorse, on deep peat 40 centimetres requires a licence. The regulations themselves don't mention blanket bog, but the explanatory memorandum associated with the regulations does talk about blanket bog, and lots of the communications that DEFRA have done around the regulations also refer to blanket bog. So we have this conflation. Now, I think it's important because we don't want protection of deep peat that is blanket bog and not protection of deep peat that is something else. I think we should discuss also variation in depth, and I think other people have spoken about this. If we are regulating or defining policy on the basis of whether peat is deep or not deep, how do we know whether it's deep peat or not? Richard pointed out that you can't tell from the standing on the vegetation what the depth of the peat underneath your feet is. We know perfectly well that we can stand on peatlands that have got a plain surface, but we can't assume that across that surface the underlying mineral base is at the same elevation. So it's perfectly conceivable that you're standing on a plain surface peatland, but underneath your feet, as you move around, the depth of peat varies considerably. So how do we account for that variation? And it matters because if we're regulating, the regulators and the regulated need to know whether they're on peat of the threshold value that those regulations apply to or not. And we know that there is small scale variation in that. And how do we account for that small scale variation? Well, what scale is it appropriate to map peat depth, and how do we make use of that in regulation? I also want to talk about what I call redeposited peat. We know that there's been lots of peat erosion, and that eroded peat has, some of it anyway, has been redeposited somewhere else. So not all the peat that we find is in situ in the place that it was formed. We've got deposits of peat that have been where the peat has developed somewhere else, but has now been removed around the landscape. And there must be questions about how functional that peat is, how it can support or deliver the ecosystem services that we might expect from peat in its proper condition. Andrew talked about emissions of peat. I would hazard a guess, don't know, but hazard a guess that the emissions from redeposited peat are probably greater than the emissions from peat in good condition. Don't know that, but I think that's a reasonable proposition. So we've got this problem with peat that's been moved around. How should it be managed? Do we apply regulation to it in the same way as we would to autochthonous peat, or do we do something else? If peat has been eroded from blanket bog, is the redeposited peat also blanket bog, or is it something else? And I also want to talk about former deep peat. I'm sure this is an issue for the whole of the UK, but certainly a huge issue in England, that over huge areas of England we have had peat subject to surface peat removal. This is an example of peat cutting for fuel. That's a recent picture within the last few years. So that's a character who thinks he's doing a good thing, by sustainable management, not burning fossil fuels and all that. But he's busy cutting peat to burn. Over the last several centuries, that kind of activity has affected probably thousands of hectares in England. Huge areas have had the surface peat stripped off for fuel for domestic consumption, or possibly for industrial use. In the Pennines, they used peat for in the smelting of lead, for example. So massive scale activity. Also, peat has been stripped off, particularly in the lowlands, for uses, initially used as horse bedding, and more recently as horticultural peat. When I came up on the train the other day, saw a site that was happening. So it's still happening in Scotland, at least. It's probably still happening somewhere in England as well. Also in England, we know that there have been severe fires which have probably removed the surface peat, and the effect of erosion, either natural or exacerbated by human activity, has also contributed to that. So large areas have no longer got the original peat surface, and we can ask the question about what is the condition of that peatland? What's the condition of the acrotelm that we've got there now? Is there an acrotelm? At best, it's a secondary acrotelm that we've got. And how functional can that peat be? How do we treat that in regulation? Is it appropriate to treat peat that might now be 20 or 30 centimetres in depth because the surface has been removed in a different way compared to how you would treat a peatland that's maybe nearby that has a deeper peat? So if, for example, in that image, somebody wanted to burn the peat on the higher part on the right of the image, might need a license from Secretary of State. If we're trying to burn the peat on the left, it might not, because not 40 centimetres. Well, why is that? Why is that a significant difference? And finally, I just wanted to make some sort of concluding remarks. Andrew described how complicated the world is, and there's a tendency for regulation to want to make it simple, but Andrew seemed to suggest that they're trying to make it harder. But we talked to DEFRA quite a lot about regulating on peat, and they want a simple message to convey to politicians. But peatland landscapes are not simple; they're complicated, and the centuries of exploitation of them and the degradation that's been a consequence has added complexity to that. And worth noting that as well as defining peat by depth, there are other definitions, and Andrew referred to some of those, and that adds further to the complexity. So as in my world, where we are advisors to people who make policy with a capital P and regulations with a capital R, it's our job to try and help those people make sense of all of that and simplify it, and the peat research community can help us with all of that. And to go back to Richard's point about being blind to all the peat that doesn't meet the definitions that politicians want to put on it or others want to put on it, can we please stop talking about peat definitions based on anything to do with depth and just talk about peatlands as a whole, because all of it is important. And to echo a point that I think that Richard made, if we talked about all peat as opposed to deep peat, in England at least, we would very much more than double the extent of habitat that we are concerned about. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
So it's simple, this problem, isn't it? I think that's what we've heard from Mark and Andrew. Actually, it's quite a simple one to crack. We're going to get a different perspective on things now. And it's a pleasure to welcome Emily Taylor and Alistair Lockett, who are going to give us a bit of a double act, but from a very practical perspective.
Yes, okay, so we're going to tag team this. I've got the mic, so I move about too much. Okay, so I'm going to really take us back to real practical terms in the context in which we're looking at peatland restoration in Scotland. And interestingly, this is a presentation I've adapted from a presentation I gave to an estates natural capital steering group, because they can understand why our spreadsheets reporting peatland restoration were so complicated. So this is me trying to explain all the various ways in which we talk about peatland and restoration areas and all the rest of it. So you're going to hear from me why peat depth really does determine delivery. So the common questions I get from landowners: where should we restore and why? How much of our peatland will we restore kind of year on year? What's our programme of peatland peatland restoration going forward? How much will it cost? Can we get funding? How long is it going to take to restore all of our peatland? Great, so let's examine the answers. So, where should we restore and why? Okay, well, let's establish where the peat is. Hang on, what is peat? Is peat peatland? Is peat shallow peat, deep peat? Is it slopey peat? Is it lowland peat? Okay, we need a lot of time to figure that out and try and work it out ourselves. How much of our peatland will we restore in a year? Well, it depends on the size of projects, but kind of depends on the amount of peat you've got that needs restored, but we need to do quite a lot of work to determine that. And that depends on extent, condition and resourcing. Hang on, kind of depends on what you mean by much, because they might be thinking area, they might be thinking carbon, they might be thinking biodiversity improvements. So again, a lot to unpick just with that simple question. How much will it cost? Can we get funding? Well, we'll tell you, but our costs are based on actual costs, so we can't tell you that until we know where the peat is, what condition it's in, is it deep, is it shallow, is it eligible for funding. So on it goes, on it goes. And this is really important now, because area in Scotland really determines cost per hectare, which determines whether or not we'll get funded. Okay, so area is now a big deal, really big deal for us. How long will it take to restore our peatland? Well, that depends on how much peat needs restoration, and what you call peat, and what you want to restore, how you're going to restore it, all the rest of it. So these very simple questions that we get asked, usually in Tesco's at 8 o'clock at night, we can't really answer, okay? But what's interesting is we're developing ways of answering it in our different regions and with our different landowners. So let's examine the how much peat is our question. And peat, peatland, bog, all used interchangeably. Okay, so it'd be really helpful if we could define what we're talking about here and kind of unify how we're describing peat, peatland, whatever it is we're using in this context. So, kind of first port of call might be our carbon and peatland map that we have in Scotland that Nature's got produced. And this is a kind of useful map. It's based on soils information, but also vegetation information. So could really help determine where the peat is for our restoration projects. So the red bits are what we might call deeper peat, so this will be your blanket bog, and then your blue bits are all the other peaty soils, which could be deep peat in parts, but could be shallow peat. So quite a lot kind of unknown. And then we have these very strange straight lines that appear in our map. So clearly this is not really representative of what's actually going on the ground. So we then think, right, we need to do quite a bit of survey here. And how do you survey? With your boots on the ground, out and about in these hills. So quite a lot to do. This area here, about 819 hectares. Okay, and we've determined that survey area just based looking at aerial images, our knowledge of the ground, kind of joining up, speaking to the landowner, okay, where are you interested in restoration? Can you start that process? Good, so then we get a feel for what's happening on the ground and start mapping and look, drained. Lo and behold, drains everywhere. Little bit of erosion going on there too. So we can start to draw our restoration area. So we can start to answer some of the questions that we're getting asked. We're now looking here about 380 hectares of what we think needs restored would make a really sensible project. Awesome, great. Then we commission a peat depth survey. Okay, now just in that area, 380 hectares, that's 967 peat depths. 967. Okay, think of the folk out on the hills doing these peat depth surveys, okay? So this has increased massively because this is shallow peat in parts in this area, so we now flip to a 50-metre grid to meet the criteria for the Peatland Code. Okay, so the resource involved here is not insignificant. Great, so now what we can do is we can draw the Peatland Code area because the estate here wants to do both peatland action but validate it as a Peatland Code project too. Okay, but oh, hang on. We're now just talking 224 hectares. The immediate question, where have all the hectares gone? You said we were going to be restoring nearly 400 hectares. Oh, sorry, but for the code it's actually 224 because we use a different buffer. We use different peat depth criteria to determine the project, the duration of the project, and all the very complex criteria that go with it. So, after lots of revising the maps, looking at the different really complicated criteria for various funding mechanisms, we ended up with a project that was 293 hectares. And this is what we're calling the restoration footprint, and this is actually the peatland action buffer, but kind of justified and pulled in places. So we would apply a 50-metre buffer to our restoration features. But we've had to really think about this because this is typical of our kind of ground. It's a mixture of shallow peat and deep peat. So we've literally sat and thought about every peat depth because the majority of peat depths have to be over 50 centimetres to meet the criteria for a Peatland Code project. So there we have, 3 different area figures. And as I said, that's really important because the actual cost of restoration doesn't change just because we've decided a different buffer to use to calculate area. These are our costs based on the actual prescribed methods that we're going to be using. And that's really, really important because we're now much smaller. Our price per hectare went up, okay, because of our peat depth survey showing more shallow peat depths than we thought because we were looking at the ground and thought actually this feels like deep peat. It's not, as you said, we have to go in and actually understand that with a peat depth survey. So our cost per hectare kind of went up by about £160, I think. And this is pretty critical when we start looking at cost per hectare, determining whether or not we get funding or not. So it's also really important to think this problem is going to go on and on and on. On this estate, this is the area of the different peaty soil types that we're looking at. So yeah, lots of deep peat. We could say deep peat is basin peats, blanket peats, great. Shallow peats, or what could be deep peat and part peats, could be all the rest. So you're looking at a difference, 3,000 hectares versus, 24,000 hectares. So it's quite significant. So when we get asked how much peat have we got, how much of it needs restored, well, it could be like 5,000 hectares, it could be 25,000 hectares. It's quite hard to kind of determine anything with that sort of discrepancy in the figures that we're quoting. Now, I'm not going to go into it too much, but do remember this is not just about peatland restoration. Forestry is a massive, massive pressure for us in the southwest of Scotland, and we have policies that basically are determined by the centimetre of peat depths. So we see new planting, conifers, commercial conifers going into 49 centimetres of peat, and then we're restoring the 50 centimetre bit. Okay, that it doesn't make any sense, okay? So, in conclusion, what should we be doing? Is this really the right approach for us at a very practical level? The more inconsistency we have between strategies and policies and funding criteria, the more complexity the more uncertainty for landowners and managers, the more risk. Okay, the less people that will engage with this. Okay, so we really do need to start bringing things together and make it simple. Is there a more useful way of looking at this? Well, actually, yes, for us with this estate, absolutely. We're looking at hydrology. So now what we're doing is we're reporting hydrological units. And we're saying, yeah, it could be deep peat, it could be shallow peat, but all the hydrology is connected, it all needs restored. So we're now reporting that unit area. Within that, there'll be the carbon claimable area, which will be the Peatland Code criteria. There'll be the deep peat restoration funded area, the Peatland action bit that can be funded, and the shallow peat area, well, the estate's going to do that themselves. Okay, so what's interesting with this is we're coming up with a strategy with this landowner out with the discussion in this room. Okay, because people are having to work out how to do this before we all agree on a kind of simple system that works. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Alistair.
It's a tough act to follow, all three people. What amazing questions from the landowners, because most of ours just say, how much money can I make from it? And how much is it going to cost me? So, yeah, really, really good. So I'm Alistair Lockett. I'm a senior field officer with the North Pennines National Landscape. So we used to be North Pennines AONB, if that isn't a term that you've heard of before. And I'm like Emily, a practitioner. So just wanted to give a bit of background about kind of our peat depth kind of measurements and things like that. So only very recently we actually started doing peat depth. Most of our peat depth probably 3 years ago, and before that was all to do with moorland tracks. That's the only peat depth that we ever took. Everything else we didn't bother. So this is a site in the North Pennines with the black as the estate boundary, and these pink areas are kind of aerial identified bare peat areas. So we would have walked past and across all these blanket bog and just surveyed these areas, and we wouldn't have taken any peat depth at all. And then we standardised it on the 100-metre grid, like followed basically all the other peat programmes in England and Scotland. And what it does is means that we cover a lot more ground. We identify a lot more features. So actually from the peat depth aspect, it might not tell us huge amounts, but it forces us to cover a lot more ground. And it means that we identify a lot more erosion features, which can only be a good thing. But you can see, so this blue layer is the priority habitat layer for blanket bog. Blue points are less than 40 centimetres, and then orange points, but you can already see some inconsistencies there for points. This is our peat depth map. So again, blue layer is priority habitat for blanket bog. So that's 11,500 points, and we haven't done very much at all. So we don't know very much about our peat depth in the North Pennines. But for practitioners, for us on the ground, what does it tell us? So we are guided by peat depth using the 100-metre grid for some restoration interventions. So for example, bunding, so these scallop bunds that we've started putting in to create more standing water and re-wet the peatlands where the hydrology is like the water table is really, really low. We only put these in soils that are greater than 50 centimetres, and that's purely from a practical side where you have to do deep trench bunding with the digger, and you have to get down and key them in and make sure you get through all the degraded peat at the top so it seals. We also use peat depth on a much finer scale, so every intervention we put in, so peat dam, wooden dam, stone dam, coir rolls, we always do a peat depth for every single intervention, because that tells us what interventions goes into there, which is very time consuming, but very worthwhile. And obviously, if we can, we do use peat dams because they're cheaper and much more effective. So, shallow peat, deep peat, you know, there's many more smart people in this room than me, and you know, it is a very difficult thing to get your head round, and land managers are looking for that very simple approach, and what depth does is give them that simple approach. You know, they aren't going to go out doing ecological surveys, vegetation surveys, looking at hydrology. They're just not going to do that. But what I would want to say is that, you know, we used to use 50 centimetres, we now use 40 centimetres, but with trees it's 30 centimetres. And I've learned quite a lot in this session. It's been really good because I always learned that like I always kind of thought that 50 centimetres was, you know, guided by science, and it was, you know, it had. It could support like fully functioning blanket bog vegetation at a certain depth. Obviously, that's completely wrong. And for us in the North Pennines, that difference between 39 centimetres and 40 centimetres, it changes, you know, the management. It changes the grazing. It determines whether an estate can burn or whether they have to cut. And you know, we're not the best at measuring. You know, even if, you know, we could get 2 centimetres out, you know, we've got 10 centimetre marks on our rods. It doesn't take much to get slightly different, but it does have big implications on the estates. And we're getting to the point where these estates are focusing on these, you know, very arbitrary, very simplistic peat depth, where we are asked to be doing cores to get super accurate measurements of peat, to make sure that we are not overestimating the deeper peat, the 40 centimetres peat, compared to anything shallow, because they are still keen on managing with prescribed burning in those shallow peat areas. And unfortunately, Natural England just can't help, like can't do anything about that. You know, they work to that rule as well, and you know, we give peat depth maps and they're on 100-metre grid, but that 100-metre grid is such a massive scale. Like, you know, things change a lot in 100 metres, and even on a 50-metre grid, again, things change quite a lot. So yeah, it doesn't give a very useful picture, I don't find. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Emily. Alistair, sorry, not Andrew. Some names you give me there. Right, we're going to move into a bit of a Q&A panel session now. I think I'm sure you've all got questions about those specific presentations. There was an awful lot in there, but we'd also like to hear some of your views around the direction of travel. You know, the title of this workshop was around historic definitions and the challenges, and it's been beautifully illustrated by some superb presentations this morning. The question in the title of the workshop was, you know, that need for a unified UK-wide approach. And it actually says about peat depth. Perhaps depth isn't the issue. So I think there's something around getting unity here. Excuse me. Andy Mills is joining us at the front as well. Andy, you haven't done a presentation. Would you like just to introduce yourself to people?
Yeah, I will do. Hi, I'm Andy Mills. I'm a peatland geomorphologist. I am doing a presentation this afternoon, so I haven't just swarmed in. But yeah, because it was a late session. Anyway, so yeah, my background, obviously peatland geomorphology as related to onshore wind primarily, but that involves a lot of peatland restoration now. So and I collect peat depths like many others and spend a lot of time trying to work out when it is and isn't peat. So I'll chip in as I can.
Thank you very much, Andy. Okay, right. We'll start, just because it's easier for the mic run, we'll start at the back there and then we'll come up here.
Okay, thanks. That's a great start, I think, to the discussion. So, Dave, I might be directing my question to you. Sorry, I'm Stuart Brooks, by the way, chair of the IUCN People Programme. So we've kind of heard about the difficulties of the complexities of kind of competing definitions. I'm quite interested to know what the other drivers might be of us either maintaining this complexity or removing it. And in particular, I'm thinking about our kind of obligations around international conventions and commitments. So Ramsar has a definition which doesn't include depth. IPCC, as far as I'm aware, doesn't have a definition of peat at all. And in the context of climate change, I kind of wonder whether that's a problem generally. So is there anything that we, I guess, need to be aware of, or should even be trying to influence from a kind of global policy perspective that might then kind of drive kind of a change in UK policy?
Does anybody else want to chip in on this one?
If any of the panel want to speak, if we just go to the
Yeah.
next the mics.
Right, so I'll start the ball rolling, and others may have a view here. So we don't have it. I think you touched on some of the key ones here. So under the convention relating to climate change, we have to account for our carbon emissions. That's just part of what we do, and I think Andrew illustrated it beautifully when he sort of did that pull apart on land use. And so I think that carbon reporting is very high on the political agenda. It's high in the awareness of it more generally is quite high. I think beholds us to really standardise, because otherwise we are comparing apples and oranges between different countries, and that is unhelpful in negotiations. It becomes a technical detail that as negotiators you can really zoom in on, and it can then obfuscate progress towards agreements. So I think we need it for that reason, precisely. We've got obligations under Cumy-Montreal agreements as well, in terms of making progress towards nature recovery. And again, it's being able to, it gets into that notion of, are we comparing apples and oranges? Countries, we are reporting to the next COP around what the UK PLC has done to recover nature and what our trajectory is. Actually, peatlands, wherever we end up, are a big part of that equation. And again, we end up with different countries comparing different things, and that can really quite undermine agreements. And we saw that sort of breakdown with the sort of agreement in relation to Paris and climate change. Lots of good intention following the Paris Agreement, but actually what's mired it down is some of that technical detail and countries arguing about what counts, what doesn't count. So I think you're right. I think there's an international imperative. I think the UK, particularly in relation to the topic of this conference, I think we've done a lot of thinking about this in quite important ways. I think we are acutely aware of the importance of the peat resource in the UK, and it's an area where we can proffer a definition, I think, that could have that sort of international weight. Go on, Andrew.
I think for me there's two things I kind of see. There's two things. So the detail of the greenhouse gas inventory, the requirements that countries have to meet to report their international emissions that are established in the international convention include categories which are very precise. And a few years ago, when I started this particular role, I thought, okay, what are peatland emissions? Went to the greenhouse gas inventory and immediately hit the problem that they're not listed. And the categories are all completely different and extremely difficult to isolate peatland emissions. So then I went off to ask the Scottish Government. They said, what are peatland emissions? And they said, oh, you better ask the UK Government. So I went to the UK Government. They sent me to the Business Department, who sent me to CEH. And then finally you get some data, and then you realise that actually the way that the international convention works doesn't help us. So in one respect, there's a sort of lobbying, a sort of an argument that there could be a change in the inventory, complicated by the fact that actually it's an international thing and we're not only, other countries will have different ideas. But if the inventory was differently constructed, it would help us to be able to report those emissions in a way which is more transparent. But having said that, the Scottish Government, to its credit, has just reported in a different way anyway. So in the most recent Scottish greenhouse gas statistics, the graph that I showed that separated out grassland, forestry, peatland and so on, isn't required. They decided to show it that way. So on the one hand, yes, you do have to have, there is potential for driving international change to improve peatland reporting, but it doesn't preclude action at the level where policy is made anyway. So the Scottish Government has created a set of data which gives us greater transparency on developing Scottish policy. So I think you probably need both.
Yeah, but fundamentally, I think we would all benefit, wouldn't we? And this seems to be the kind of direction of travel of this conversation around an agreed definition which excludes peat depth.
Yeah.
And if that were to happen at the global and therefore also kind of
yes.
UK level reporting,
exactly.
a lot of this
the implications would be profound.
That doesn't preclude the other issues that you raised around kind of land use. Sorry, that doesn't preclude the other issues you raised around kind of competing land uses, and then actually what the consequence of that kind of policy change would be for land use, and that's kind of gnarly. I get that. I'm just saying all of this because there is I guess there's a kind of sequence, that's kind of coming up towards the World Conservation Congress, and the IUCN has been quite instrumental in kind of helping to influence some of that global policy around peatlands. So, and given its unique kind of position of being membership of governments and NGOs, I would kind of like to think that if we could kind of work towards a bit of a consensus on this, then we could kind of take that consensus and try and get that adopted as a global IUCN kind of advocacy position.
Yeah, it would certainly help from an advocacy point of view of someone engaging in policy, being able to point to an international standard is extremely helpful.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to suggest that if you're going to try and change the way people approach peat, you need to be careful what you wish for. And future-proof the ask or the definitions that you're applying. And the reason I suggest that is that we are saddled still with the definitions of peat that Richard Lindsay described from the people who want to extract it and remove it, from people who wanted to exploit it for farming or for forestry or whatever it is. We're still stuck with the values, the numbers that those people came up with decades ago. So if we change the basis for definition of peat, we need to understand why what's important, what are we trying to protect peat from, or what we're trying to get out of peat. So we've got the carbon emissions. It's a really important thing, and that's probably very new. It's only the last few years that we've really understood the significance of that. And thinking about the blanket bog strategy for England that Natural England produced in 2015, I don't think it was very strong on on carbon emissions. It was probably a factor in there, but not as strong as it would be now if we were doing it now. So for the future, the stressing the importance of peat for biodiversity, yes, that's still important. Water relations and flood mitigation and water supply are probably still important, but we probably ought to stress the climate argument much more powerfully than we have done before. But we should also stress the general resilience, and Andrew picked this up earlier on and pointed out that shallow peat is probably more vulnerable to all sorts of things than deep peat is. So there's a reason for focus on shallow peat, pointing out that we've dismissed it as, and Richard's pointed out that it's invisible. It's not entirely invisible, but it needs much more focus than we've given it in the past, because it is more vulnerable to anything compared to deep peat, and that maybe should colour your approach in the future. Thank you, Dave.
Right, I'm good. Go over here now for the next.
Hi, I'm Christopher Pratt from National England. I work on the England peat map. I just want to say I feel a bit out of my depth. These are maybe a bit techie observations. First of all, I totally agree we should work towards a definition of peat that doesn't include depth, but I'm really interested in depth, modelling depth and mapping depth. I think at the outset of the England peat map proposal, we said we're going to model depth in centimetres, not in classes, and I think we should just all be doing that, and just leave it to the policymakers later to demand classes of us. But we just wanted to get the data to be in centimetres. I think what's often missing, this is a bit techie, but that we talked about depth. We should be talking about average depth over a certain area, not about depth as a sort of abstract concept, as a point concept. It would be nice to get to an agreed area if we use a 10-metre grid. I think that's obviously...
Are you saying 10?
That's for our predicting.
Right.
But our observation data are 5 measurements in a 10-metre square, and it's the average of that is the peat depth of that 10-metre square. I think that concept, even if it's a bigger area, is really important, because it takes it to, with that you can then also calculate how variable it is within that area, which gives you better values. So I've got just a few techie points. I don't know if they need a response. One of them was your brilliant map of Russia. I think the error on that shallower peat is going to be humongous, and I think we need to be very upfront about that. Yes, thank you. Sorry, it wasn't a refined policy point.
No. That raised. I mean, that brings in some very important matters around. How do we measure these things, and how do we map it?
Shall I come up with the lectern?
I'm afraid you have to.
Right, I'm going to be controversial, and I'm going to be Nelson-y, and I live in Norfolk, so that's appropriate. So I want to maybe put a hand up for defending peat depth. Being careful what we wish for, I would agree with Mark here. You have to be able to collect information at a site level, and you need competencies to do that. My children could probably collect peat depth data, and they're at school, because you can put a probe in the ground and retrieve a depth. If you do it on habitat, well, habitat doesn't tell you how deep peat is, and as we know, we can get good or poor habitats on peats of all different depths. It's also a very specialist discipline, so not everybody can go out and map a habitat. Hydrology is even harder. You're trying to interpret hydrology from linear features, diffuse features, aerial photography, different interpretations of that. It's very hard to measure. The great benefit of depth is that it's very easy to measure, and you can do it at any density. So I wouldn't rule it out entirely from definition, but I would agree, firstly, there needs to be a consistent definition. I think the definition, and the developers who I work for will not like me for this, should be shallower. And probably we need to be looking at a definition that encapsulates a functional peatland, so one that's capable of delivering biodiversity, is capable of delivering water regulation, so it can develop a system where water tables can move up and down and accommodate peak rainfall events. And obviously has some carbon storage capacity, which, based on Richard's early presentation, is all peat of all depths. So I think the hydrology point that Emily made is absolutely critical. That's the element that really defines whether a peat bog is functional, and peat depth helps contribute to working that out. So I wouldn't exclude peat depth entirely. We have to think about how do we physically define an area if we're not using peat depth to do it, and someone's got to do that on the ground, and lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds have to do it. So I'll leave that there, I think. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Chris Miller. I work on the England Peat Map project. I am the field survey manager for that project, and I help put together the survey design. So I've been grappling with these issues for the past 3 years, and I just want to challenge you all. Why are we all talking about peat? Because you've all missed the other part of the definition. In the soils definition, it's not just depth, it's organic content, and above 50%. So you're talking about peat. Well, if you use that definition, then the Fenland agricultural peat doesn't exist in your minds. And we all know about we talked about the drivers for it and climate change being a big one. Well, we all know there's huge emissions coming from there. So by talking about peat, you've just gone and excluded something that you really want to include. So you need to think more about where the whole definition and where you want that definition to lie. And the England Peat Map project, we really should be called PT Map project, not peat, because we actually go down to from 20% organic content all the way up. That's what's included in our mapping. I also just want to challenge you about peat depth measurements being easy. I'm sorry, I fundamentally disagree. My experience of training surveyors to do it is that people can't identify peat soils to save their lives. They don't know what it is, and they don't know how to take peat depths. And there's frequent either under or overestimation. And had it out in the field yesterday where I was probing down, and I said, well, we've got to lay it down to 90 centimetres and then there's change. Other people probing completely missed that transition and that change, and we're going down to 2 metres 80. So it's not actually something that your children can do accurately. Yeah. They can do it, and I've done it with young people and community groups, and it's a great activity. So we really do need to think about that. And I agree entirely with Stuart's point about if we're going to change the definition away from this agricultural centric definition, what do we want it to be? What are the drivers there in making that change? Thanks.
Does anyone want to respond to that before I respond?
Go on, Andy.
I'll very briefly respond. Yeah, I was probably being a little bit light-hearted with the children comment. Yeah, there are things like refusal, hard refusal, soft refusal. When you put a probe into the ground, ideally you should do it with cores, but try doing that 1,000 times. And for wind farms, every 10 metres we probe over the full half standings, we have a 10-metre grid, so we end up with several thousand points per wind farm. They're probed to bits. And obviously those people who are doing that time and time again are pretty skilled at doing that. What I find interesting, I don't want to diverge too much here, is that even the 10-metre probing grid is not a brilliant predictor. The 100-metre grid, if you compare it with a 10-metre grid, so you predict at the 10-metre points what you got from the 100-metre grid is a very poor correlation. You'd expect it to be a borderline straight line with spread, but it's not. I think we need to use the data to establish how reliable our 100-metre grids are, and we all know we can move 2 metres at any probe location and get quite a different depth. So that's thing number one. Thing number two, in terms of organic matter content, completely agree with you. The two issues there are, particularly for agricultural soils, it's going to differ quite a lot at the top where it's been reworked and used, and to what it does at the bottom. So in theory, at every probe location, you'd want you need a sample, it's got to go out to the lab, at the bottom, which is probably the least disturbed, and at the top, which reflects recent land practices. So that's 1,000 points on one of those sites times 2, so that's 2,000 lost emission samples to get those values to help you make that classification. And I don't disagree that's a good idea, but again, we have to think about how we actually deliver that at scale, because that's what we would need to do.
Yeah, I mean, just to briefly respond, once we've decided, once we've decided on what the drivers are going to be, but by the way, I agree, that will then dictate what evidence we need to help make the decisions, and there are clearly evidence gaps that need filling. We need a better measurement technique. than just peat probing, and there are some new ones in development. And then once we've got that cracked, then we'll need to then crack the next one, which is we don't know what the spatial variation in peat depth is, and therefore we don't know what the optimal spacing on peat depth measurements that we need to take. There's this big evidence gap, but first of all we need to decide on what drivers and what definition, and therefore then that means we then go, well, right, what evidence do we need to support that, and then that then allows, particularly the guys in the field, through a presentation about that, then that helps you guys as well, because it gives you the framework to work off.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Mary Rose Lane from the Environment Agency. So I've been associated with the work down in the southwest of England for 20 odd years. I'm not a practitioner, but I work very closely with them. And certainly down there, I suppose I flip it around. I'm sort of, I think what we find is that policy constrains what we can do on the ground really dramatically. And I know I'm speaking for practitioner colleagues here where, the sort of detail that these guys spoke about, it's a real problem when you're actually trying to do the peat restoration that is trying to meet the targets that have been set. Targets and policy, apologies, but it can be a real problem for practitioners, because what we're trying to do is get those habitats functional again. So it was a real relief when the word hydrology was mentioned this morning, and it actually really concerned me that those of you who are working at that policy level didn't start with that word, because while the carbon story is really important, that also relies on hydrological function. And certainly one of the things that concerns me about some of the stuff in the Peat Action Plan and the Peatland Code is you can do carbon protection of peatlands without restoring hydrology, which seems completely counterintuitive to me. That you can cover bare peat in coir matting and say you've restored it for carbon, but actually you really haven't, because you haven't restored the hydrology. So all the conversation about peat, about depth, feels to me like the undulating mineral or granite layer or whatever it is underneath is also irrelevant. It's what's happening with that functioning aquifer. Is that working? And if it isn't, then you can do what you like, but you haven't restored the peat. And that really feels like that should be our starting point at every place. And so we have really significant amounts of deep peat that's been cut over, as you described really well, so that it becomes non-functional and is really, really the significant eroder. And on Dartmoor, it looks like really beautiful undulating landscape with really functional peat. All of it is damaged, every single bit, apart from tiny little fragments of blanket bog on the top of the hills, which is being dendritically eroded as well. So, but fundamentally we can't work on that really fragile interface between the blanket bog where it drops down into the cut peat or the tin stream peat, and so there are huge swathes of those moorlands that everyone assumes is self-healing. That's the word the commons use all the time. It's self-healing because there's sphagnum there, but the sphagnum is hanging on in tiny little micro-habitats that is not functional. It's still within an eroding system. And so when you're considering policy on peat depth, I know I'm sure you do, but can you really think of it from the practitioner's end of trying to get these to be functioning landscapes? Because without that, I don't really know why we're bothering, if I'm really honest.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anybody want to respond to that? There was a bit of a policy challenge.
On the question of hydrology, absolutely agree with you. It's not restored until the hydrology is functional again. And if it's any consolation, we talk an awful lot about functional peat, and by that we mean hydrologically functional. I sometimes fear that we're just talking, word soup, and no one understands what we're talking about. But hey ho. But so certainly in conversations in natural England would always focus on hydrological functionality. So hopefully that's some sort of reassurance to you. On the policy side, it's the policies that generate the revenue, the funding. So until the politicians have signed off policy, there won't be funding associated with it that drives the restoration that you crave. So it is, I guess, a job for people like me and him probably to prevail on politicians that restoration to hydrological function is very important. And there is an initiative going on in England anyway called the Peat Restoration Roadmap, which is trying to work out a pathway to restore 280,000 hectares of peatland by 2050 or whatever. Sorry. And I don't know how much money they think they're going to need for that, but there you go. But pisses me up. Part of that process is a definition of what is restored. And I think that could best be described as the art of the possible. Bearing in mind you've got to bring in all of the stakeholders and get them to agree what restored is. And that won't be perfect, possibly from your perspective and probably from our perspective either. But to get to the point where people are signed up to restoring 280,000 hectares, there's got to be the consensus as to what actions are going to be taken to deliver that. And that colours the definition of what restored is. I think I would agree with you that simply covering it with core matting isn't good enough, but there may be a halfway house somewhere.
Andy and Emily want to chip in, so
again, I'll just respond a little bit. It's a really good point that you raise. I think we do need to recognise that the Peatland Code does allow restoration from active eroding to drains to save carbon, so the code might need to be considered in that discussion too. But I think, again, just from a kind of very practical point of view, I suppose I'm in the southwest of Scotland and we're experiencing climate change, absolutely, and in the past 5 years our sites where it have been very stable are now in a new phase of erosion. And I think it's totally changed where we're prioritising restoration, so we're looking at where do we still have that function, but where is it really, really vulnerable? And so those are the sites that we're now prioritising, get them sourced out before they go into a phase where we lose that function entirely, and then you're fighting that losing battle. So I think it's a really key consideration, and I think it has real practical implications of what we choose to do there right now. Yeah.
Thank you. I think just in relation to what you were saying about being able to do things on the ground, so the issue with regulation and policy and a definition is that if it's an on-off switch, it's very contentious for precisely the reasons that everybody said, that plus or minus 1 centimetre determines opportunities for funding, ability to develop or construct, from my point of view, things like that. And I don't think that's very helpful. We need more nuance, as in all things. You need yes, no, and yes, but. So we will do it if there is some reasonable opportunity for the trajectory of that bog or peat deposit to move back in the right direction. But we won't do it if that isn't possible, because it's a waste of money, it's a waste of time, there may be other better options for that site. So we need to think that through. And much as it's nice to have a yes-no policy, because it's easy and it's easy to understand, it's not constructive. So we need more nuance.
Just in response to the question about policy getting in the way, it's okay, that's totally fine. To some extent, I agree with you, because the threshold has perverse consequences, and it ends up creating an artificial threshold and then driving behaviour in a way which is counterproductive. So you end up with forestry up to a line that makes no sense, that sort of stuff. So to some extent, I agree with you. But I guess what comes to my mind is that we have to remember that not everyone's top priority is restoring the peatland. And the role of the policy and the legislation is to some extent to defend the public interest. So it is to say that it is in the public interest that trees aren't planted on this area because this is special in some way. And the arbitrary 50 centimetre thing is imperfect, and entirely imperfect, because it's arbitrary. But that's the messy compromise that's been arrived at. So policy, yes, it can end up with perverse consequences, but it also has a function, because for those people who are just trying to run a business and their priority isn't restoration, they actually want to plant some trees, or they want to run a sporting operation, or they want to do their farming, there is a role for the regulation to defend the public interest, to say that actually, while it's legitimate that you may have those other interests, the public interest means that you can't do absolutely anything, and that we're trying to protect some places. And my role is to some degree to try and make it better. So it's imperfect, but make it better.
Can I just really quickly come back?
Yes.
Surely the opportunity through the IUCN is to try and influence with the very best possible standards. I suppose that's what I was trying to get at, that the IUCN can stand apart from that and actually say, whilst all those public interest arguments are going on, this is actually what we really need for the true protection of our peatlands.
Yes.
That gold standard side of things, yeah. This one here is next.
I'm Daniel Lyons, I'm from Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust, and I do a lot of restoration work on lowland peat. So I don't really have a question, but when it comes to definitions and standardised methodologies, is it important to recognise the differences between upland and lowland, because they're not the same, particularly with, for example, probing. It just won't work at a lowland scenario, especially on agricultural lowlands. So, yeah, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, I think that's a really helpful reminder, because actually, I mean, it illustrates some of the challenges that we have in terms of, that much of today's presentations was focused on upland peats, and the lowlands are a different challenge in some respects. So I think, thank you for that, because it's important when we start to think, when we start to talk, when we start to think about, some form of unified definition. We need to not just think about stuff up the hill. Well, unless people want to carry on for a little bit, I'm quite. So,
just mindful of lunch.
Right, this lady here has been waving her hand a lot. So
sorry, I don't mean to be overbearing. Hi, my name is Marlena. I work for the RSPB up in Flow Country. I am very much a practical worker up there. I'm seeing the projects that you guys are involved in. It just echoes all the things that I get frustrated with. So one of the things that I've been coming into contact with is we are trying to develop quite large sites up in the flows, and we are quite dependent in terms of delivering those on time on making sure that we have all those peat depths, which is largely handed over to volunteers. When I send our volunteers out, I am very conscious that if they take a peat probing point and they find a 49, that's going to catalyst and make sure that I have to do those 8-9 points around it, and 8-9 points, and it's going to absolutely snowball. So it makes it really difficult to plan your ground truthing, your data collection, and what we do in the flows, because we have so much DP, is we try to focus our restoration on the deeper peat areas. So what I would like to do, which currently I don't seem to find a pathway to do that in, is to see if I look at my drone imagery and I see that rocky hill bit in the middle of my bog, and I know that's going to be shallow peat, I want to exclude that as a polygon from my restoration plan, but I'm not allowed to. I have to abide by the side boundaries, which then show us how much of your site is shallow and how much is deep. That determines your peatland code project length. But in terms of making it back to the feasibility of developing our projects, it would be so much simpler. I don't want to send those machines in that shallow bit anyway. Why can I not exclude that area entirely? So in a sense, I'm asking for the flexibility around developing those areas and kind of cherry picking which hectares I'm going to kick out anyway, because I have no business going in there, and I don't want to do the field work for it. It's too much.
Okay, thanks. And that, you know, brings us back to that whole challenge around how does this topic interface with policy and regulation codes.
Sorry, I have to come in. So I'm Nicole Bell from the University of Edinburgh. So I'm going to give a science perspective on some of this discussion, and I think we definitely need to move away from peat depth. And the reason being, going back to Richard Lindsay, really is the fact that if we were thinking about emissions, then of course we are thinking about carbon. So that 10 centimetres can hold more carbon than 50 centimetres. That's fundamental. And it's also the type of carbon. So we also have a definition of carbon quality. And so you could have 50 centimetres where 40 of it is undecomposed, or relatively undecomposed moss, which is mainly carbohydrates, and that will decompose much faster if you lower the water table and drain it, compared to something which has got, 50 centimetres of recalcitrant carbon, which will not really do very much when you expose it so much. So that fundamental thing about peat depth means absolutely nothing when it comes to how these emissions actually come to par if you were to damage that peatland or not, or even restore it. And then when we have a restoration, that's when the hydrology comes in. Because in the whole story of why is carbon such a good carbon store in the first place, it all comes down to it being all of the processes, all the carbon cycling, always come back to anoxia. And that is only happening when you have water wall conditions. So I think we need to come to total carbon, organic matter quality, when it comes to a proper definition of our peatlands. And there is methods now that will be able to use that. If you take a peat core and take a photograph of it and look at the RGA balance, you can get some idea about decomposed, undecomposed peat. So the methods are coming there, but we really do need to move away from that. Otherwise, we're going to be in a difficult situation when it comes to our emissions down the line.
Thank you. Right, lady at the back, right at the back there.
Last one.
That's it. We started 2 minutes late, so we can overrun.
I'm Juliet. I also work for Natural England in the north of England, so I live across the border in Scotland, so I see some of those disparities as far as forestry in particular. Probably my comments are going to focus around. I would say yes, move away from depth, but in the interim, because this isn't going to be a quick process, that's what's currently being referred to. That's what's currently open to abuse, unfortunately. One observation as a practitioner is that, particularly where it's sort of potential new forestry, it's kind of open to who does those peat depths, how honest are they? Quite often it is land agents or associated surveyors that it's in their interest to find the right depth of peat. So I'm sure that's stating the obvious, but there's a real obvious difference from north to south. I'm not defending England saying everything's perfect, it's as open to abuse there as it is elsewhere, but those are not verified. We're losing peat every day by applications that are going in for, call it woodland, which I consider to be native. It's commercial forestry, which will knacker that peatland. So that's just a little point of reality. The other thing is around the lady's point about policy being a blocker, and your comeback, Andrew, was good, but as someone that works for Natural England at grassroots level, I am very interested in peatland, but I'm also very interested in how that fits into the wider environment and all the biodiversity that should be there. So these policies and lines and fixed points lose that interface where a lot of the sort of wider wildlife context should be, and we want to see it there. And some of the agri-environment schemes and things are aimed at not only hopefully addressing peatlands where it's possible and where cost allows, but also having that edge effect where so much wildlife should be present and isn't. So I guess just stating the obvious that lines don't always help. Yes, as a protective means, but in a dynamic ecological environment, you don't want hard edges, you want that connectivity. And just on the hydrological connectivity, Mark, you know that I struggle with that as far as currently, how do we actually advise on that? How do we measure that? How do we say to even our own forestry enterprise colleagues, you can do that new planting because it's not hydrologically connected, or you know, we would advise against it. So there's clearly some more sort of science needed at grassroots level to help people to make those local decisions, because your policy is so far removed from what's happening on the ground that we need those, you know, techniques, additional advice, guidance, whatever, quickly, because it's constantly being eked away at in forestry terms, anyway, from where I sit on the kind of border.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to draw this to a close. How would I'm not sure I can summarise that discussion. But I think there were some really important reminders in there. So there was the spatial thing, you know, lowlands, uplands, right? Wherever we go with this, we need to remember that side of things. Your last point there, you know, the hydrology, the functionality, actually being able to translate that from a sort of grand science method into something that can be applied at a local level in projects. So the scalability of a definition is important. That's what's coming out. I think your points are were really important. You know, taking advantage of new and emerging methods. So not necessarily constraining ourselves by the methods of the past. I'd like to thank all the speakers. In fact, yeah, for really rich contributions and very stimulating and provocative, which is always good. And thank you very much for paying such close attention, for asking some really probing questions, and sharing your views as well, because this was about sharing views as well as just Q&A. So thank you very much, everybody. That's been a really valuable session for me. I hope it's been valuable for you as well. Thanks.